Thank you all for joining today. My name is Frank Martinez. Today's session is another installment of the State of Cybercrime in 30 Minutes with incident response expert Matt Radolec. He is joined by David Gibson, our Chief Marketing Officer here at Varonis. So without any further ado, I present Matt Radolec and David Gibson. How's it going, guys?
Hey, everyone. It's great to be here today. We appreciate you guys being here. Joined today by Chief Marketing Officer David Gibson. If you want to say hi, David.
Hi, David.
Let's dive right in. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to go through today, as our show is going to have a few different segments. First, we're going to talk about, is there any good news? Then we'll revisit Log4Shell. Where are we now? We'll jump on the highway to the danger zone, talk about some threat actors that you should be concerned about, dive into some vulnerabilities. We'll have a segment on Don't Make Me Tell You I Told You So, and then our first ever Viewer Appreciation Awards. So let's crack into it. First, is there any good news? On our first ever, yeah, I sure hope so, right, David? on our first ever episode of the State of Cybercrime, we talked about threat actors, exploits, and things that people should be concerned about. And one audience member said, is there ever any good news in cybersecurity? So we always want to start the show with a segment on hopefully some positive news in cyber world. Let's see what there is today. I'm sure that you remember on our last segment, we talked about the resurgence of Revil, or what we called Revil. So let's revisit that. Recently, the FSB, or the Russian Federal Security Service, raided various Revil hideouts across Russia, making arrests, seizing millions worth of cryptocurrency, rubles, dollars, luxury cars, and apartments. And the FSB touted U.S. intelligence as being a critical and credible source and being able to make those arrests. Now, of all of the Revil or associated Revil entities that were arrested, 14 were detained and 8 have been charged with money laundering. I do think it's important to note only charged with money laundering, no computer crimes or hacking charges have been brought against the detained persons yet. One of those suspects is believed to be behind the attack on the U.S. oil and gas pipeline. I'm wondering of all of our attendees today, if anyone remembers what it felt like if they lived on the Atlantic seaboard, what it was like when that pipeline went down and everybody was scrambling to go and try to fill up their cars. I'm also curious whether or not you think we'll see more collaboration between U.S. intelligence sources and the FSB in the future to bring down more Russian hacker groups.
It's a great question. Let's check in our poll, huh?
Yeah, so I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is this the end of Revil? Will we hear from them again? Will they strike back? Or will they maybe rebrand themselves? Really curious to see what your feedback is. Well, it looks like a majority of people, and I'm in your camp, think that Revil's going to remain on the dark side or in some sort of cartel and that this isn't the end. Well, as we were preparing for the webinar this morning, I have some late breaking news. Apparently, according to one security research firm, Revil is already back and rebranded as the Ransom Cartel. I'm sure we'll find on our next episode of the State of Cybercrime whether or not this proves to be true, but so far the Ransom Cartel does look, smell, and feel a little bit like Revil. On our next segment, we'll dive into something that we brought up in the past and revisit it and see where are we now. With today, it's going to be about Log4Shell or Log4j. Log4Shell is a vulnerability found in one of the most common popular logging libraries called Log4j. And this vulnerability is incredibly easy to exploit. The only thing that you need to do is send a specifically crafted string to a device that's running Log4j, and you can get complete remote control of the system, including the ability to execute remote code, or what's called an RCA, remote code execution vulnerability. For those of you that haven't attempted to do that on your own yet, let's see it in action. On the left side of the screen, you'll see a sample Java application where we are writing an input to send to a log file. On the right side of the screen, you'll see an attacker sending that magical string that causes the logging library to download that remote shell, execute the code, and as a result, the calculator app is going to spawn on that device. And at the point where you see calculator pop up, that's game over. That's where the attacker was able to execute whatever that they wanted to. Now, in our example, we just loaded calculator, which isn't that malicious and something to be concerned about. But some of the things that we talk about later are going to be a little bit more on the concerning side. I'm also curious, and please, put your guesses in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat to see who gets the closest. How many devices have been identified as vulnerable to Log4Shell?
Cue the Price is Right music. All of them.
One participant suggested all of them. I see 25 million, 400 million, 1 million, 75. These are all good guesses so far. 10 billion, 1.1 billion, 700 billion, 5 billion. Keep those guesses coming in. I'm waiting for somebody to hit it right on the head. Oh, and it looks like we've got one. The answer is actually 3 billion. 3 billion devices have been found as vulnerable to Log4j. And that's really huge. That means this is a widely popular library, and just about any organization that runs enterprise systems probably has an instance of Log4j and a vulnerable Log4Shell host inside of their environment. If it's something that you haven't taken a look at and fixed already, strongly recommend that you do so, because one of the questions that I often get asked is, is there, active exploitation? But before we dive into that, I want to get your feedback on something. How do you feel that the industry is doing in regards to responding to 0 days? Are we not doing very well and everyone is getting pwned? Are we doing great and nobody's getting compromised? Or maybe are we just doing a little bit better than, say, Sunburst when that hit, what was it, late last year? I guess it's almost 2 Christmases ago now when we were dealing with SolarWinds and Sunburst, right, David?
Yeah, it seems like forever ago, but not that long, really.
Let's see what our audience thinks. Well, it's a little bit of a split. Most people feel like we are doing better. And in fact, we did do better than when Sunburst hit. But actually, about a quarter of our audience today feels like there's still a lot of organizations that are getting pwned. So not quite at the point yet where everybody feels like we're doing better. I hope that the industry continues to evolve. Personally, I do think that the industry reacted better. I saw a lot of vendor announcements, saw a lot of organizations that had patches and mitigations available within 24, 48, or even 72 hours of the announcement of the 0 day.
That's progress.
Now, as I mentioned before, one of the things that I get asked a lot is, are there active exploitation attempts on things like Log4j and Log4Shell? Obviously, you could look at your own perimeters in order to determine that, or you could use a source like Gray Noise. Gray Noise is tracking lots of exploit attempts from different threat actors and IP addresses from around the world. Great source of intelligence, one that our research team uses here at Varonis. And one of the things that we are seeing are attempted Log4j or Log4Shell exploitation attempts. In fact, you'll see one up here at the top from this particular telecom. And when we dive in, we can even see the specific request string that's getting passed over via that vulnerable string, or what is that magic string that these threat actors are sending to try to exploit Log4j. Whereas in our scenario, we were just spawning calc.exe. So lots and lots of organizations still actively under attack for Log4Shell, and really a lot more vulnerabilities other than that. This is just the next vector that attackers have found in order to get to your data. With that said, let's jump into our next segment, On the Highway to the Danger Zone, where we're going to hear about threat actors, especially new ones that you should be concerned about. Our first threat actor is the White Rabbit ransomware. They emerged in December of 2021 in an attack on a U.S. financial institution. And a lot of people have asked me, all these names, where are they coming from? We're not so sure yet. We're still trying to get to the bottom of that. But White Rabbit in specific, what you have to be concerned about with them is they have a fairly small payload, or the actual executable itself that unleashes the ransomware. It's only a 100 kilobyte file that appears to scanners as fairly benign. One of the key functionalities there as well is that it requires a command line password to be entered in order to detonate that payload.
Hey, Matt, I think you've got some chat stuff in front of your slides. That it's a new Zoom feature. That's thank you. Now,
no problem. Appreciate that. Yeah. I think that was probably the chat and the panelist thing coming up. And what I can do is reshare out just the copy of the presentation to make sure that all that stuff is out of the way. Thanks so much, David. Appreciate all the technical help as we work through the show today.
That's what I'm here for.
When we think about, what was that password? It was just kiss me, right? Very, very simple. I do wonder though, they probably use other passwords and other payloads. Can't nearly be this simple, but time will tell. They'll also provide their clients with that dropper file, that ransomware note that gets left behind, with a Tor URL for communication to be provided back with those threat actors. And they follow a double extortion method. Now, we've talked a lot in the past about double extortion versus triple extortion or even quadruple extortion. And White Rabbit's double extortion method is where they'll exfiltrate the data. They'll ask you for the ransom before they'll post that data online on a site like Pastebin. Refusal to cooperate there would lead to encryption, where again, they'll ask for the ransom in order to get that decryption key to be able to unlock your data. Now, let's also talk a little bit more about, how can you spot a White Rabbit ransomware infection? Well, they use an extension that they append to the file name called .script. And when you get that dropper file, you're going to be redirected to a Pastebin website and a Tor URL, and you're going to be given these very explicit instructions to follow the White Rabbit. And this is a little bit about what that ransomware note is going to look like. You'll even see that little icon for the White Rabbit right there in the center. Now, in addition to White Rabbit, the other threat actor that you should be worried about is BlackCat Ransomware Group. David, would you mind telling us a little bit about BlackCat Ransomware?
Yeah, in the ongoing game of whack-a-mole, I guess this is a new ransomware as a service group. We actually released a blog post on it this AM this morning that you can go read. But it's named BlackCat due to the favicon that is on a BlackCat favicon that's used on the victim's Tor payment site. The attackers actually call the ransomware Alpha V there. We've seen a lot of activity since November. The group is actively recruiting some ex-Revil folks, Black Matter folks, dark side operators. They're paying out apparently up to 90%, and they're actually using something that's triple extortion in addition to the double extortion, where they encrypt the files. And then they steal them and threaten to leak them. They're also threatening a DDoS attack. It's pretty sophisticated ransomware. I think it's built in Rust, which is one of the newer programming languages. Uses AES. It does the usual things: privilege escalation, UAC bypass. Can propagate to other hosts with PSExec. Does the shadow copy deletion. And also goes after ESX VMware as well. So this is a new one to look out for.
One of the small bits that David just mentioned there that I really want to reiterate is threat actors also going after your VM hosts and your VM farms, as they are not immune to ransomware infection. Oftentimes we think just about systems applications. A lot of times we just think about data, but ransomware threat actors are evolving. No matter where your data is stored, whether in a virtual machine, on a file server, or in the cloud, they're going after it for exfiltration and encryption. Definitely something not just unique to BlackCat, but one of the tools in their arsenal to go after those ESXOs. Let's jump into our next segment, though, where we talk about some of the most vulnerable vulnerabilities that you should be aware of and really what you can do about them. And what's funny is, I just had some Zoom windows up on my screen, and maybe it was a little bit of an Easter egg for the vulnerabilities that we were going to talk about. So there are these zero-click vulnerabilities. Hopefully I didn't just fall for one in Zoom. Would you mind telling us about them and whether or not maybe that they've been patched, or if there's anything that people need to urgently do, David?
Yeah, absolutely. So this really interesting research on Zoom, actually over the past year or so. Back in April, as part of the Pwn to Own security competition, which was sponsored by Zoom, actually, two researchers, Don Kuiper and Thais Akama, demonstrated a remote code execution against the Windows Zoom client, and with I think 3 vulnerabilities. More recently, Natalie Silvanovich from Project Zero, and there's a link there under the photo, posted a really interesting analysis, just some light reading on 2 additional vulnerabilities, both of which were fixed in November, but a buffer overflow on Zoom clients and the Zoom servers, at least the MMR servers, which is the multimedia relay, I think it is, and which I didn't realize you could actually host that in your own environment. And there's also a possible information leak on the MMR servers, which would allow an attacker to eavesdrop on a conversation if it was not encrypted end to end. So this affects both Zoom clients and servers. It's interesting, the in order to be a zero-click attack, you have to have the attacker in as a contact in Zoom, and then the attack would come through Zoom chat or like a Zoom call. It would be a one-click attack if you joined a webinar like this one, and then somebody sent you a crafted packet that would do the remote code execution. The key takeaways: keep your clients updated and don't accept contact requests from strangers. One of the takeaways I think from the research is Zoom may be vulnerable to other exploits like this because it does not use ASLR, which is address space layout randomization. That kind of helps mitigate the threat of buffer overflows. Anyway, it's a really interesting set of research about how they fuzz the executables and did a lot of disassembly of the executables there.
One thing I want to note here, this is really just another vector, right, for an attacker to get into your organization, yet another place that you have to educate end users on where to be security aware. Oftentimes, I find that clients have all these assumptions around this extra security that may be afforded with a SaaS application, but they still have vulnerabilities. There can still be misconfigurations that lead to putting your users, your systems, and your data at risk. So always important, following regular patching, subscribing to different vulnerability announcements, coming to a show like this to make sure you find about all the threats that you have to be concerned about. In our next segment, it's actually quite interesting. I often get asked, what are some tips? What are some tales from the trenches? And I kind of like to tell you like this. Don't make me tell you I told you so. The last place that you want to hear what I'm about to tell you is when you have a critical incident, and me and the incident response and forensics team from Varonis are guiding you through what happened. So don't make me tell you I told you so. How have asset inventories helped in responding to Log4j? So, 3 billion devices needed to be patched. And you don't need to answer us in the chat, but, how many tens, hundreds, thousands were yours? Hundreds of thousands, even potentially, especially if you're in a large and complex global network. Well, thousands of those organizations reached out to help. They needed help figuring out, are we in a good space? Are we being exploited? Do we know what to do? So the Varonis Global Security Team mobilized to help our customers and prospects like we do in many of these global cyber incidents. And in the environments where it went well, it was because the client had a well-maintained inventory of all their data, systems, applications, all the versions that were running, all the different pockets of their network that existed. And there we were able to be pretty quick. Didn't find active exploitation attempts, or if we did, we were able to put in mitigations or patches to get around them. But where did it go really poorly? When the client said, I have no idea where we're running Log4j. I've never even heard of this before. Can you help us scan for it? I don't even know all the segments of my network that I have. Can you help me find it to make sure that I don't have any internet-facing segments? And hundreds and hundreds of investigative and mitigation hours went into that. So again, don't make me tell you I told you so. Might be helpful to have an inventory of all your important and data systems, applications, and devices, and all the different code libraries that you run inside of your environment. I really want to give you a perspective on data-first cybersecurity. And that is, you got to realize that if you have critical data, there's someone out there that wants it. They might already be inside of your organization. They might be an attacker or a nation state that's outside of your organization. And much like all the things that we discussed on our webinar today, there are a ton of vectors that attackers can use to get to your data, whether they come in through an endpoint, through Zoom, through an external access gateway, or perhaps they're already inside of your network. There's a lot of different ways that your data may be put at risk by an attacker or an insider threat. And it only takes one. It only takes one compromised user, one compromised device, one Zoom session gone wrong or remotely exploitable gateway with Log4Shell for an attacker to get a foothold inside of your environment. And when we work with organizations, we often find that the blast radius or the potential impact of any one user getting compromised to be far too great. From a data perspective, about on average 17 million files are exposed to every employee inside of a company. And so it's really important that you take steps to reduce that blast radius, to slow attackers down, to reduce the amount of access that any one person has, and ultimately reduce the damage of one of those incidents or breaches. And all while you're reducing that blast radius, it's also really important to watch the data, to have your eyes on those assets that you care most about, which oftentimes is your most critical files, folders, sites, applications that you have, where your most critical and sensitive data exists. Let's jump over to the Q&A, David. I've seen a few come in. One that I think I'll take, and if you have any that come to mind for you, David, why don't you jump in and take them as well? So one question that came in is really around, if Russia and other nation states will cooperate on things like going after money laundering charges, is this a good comparison to, Americans cooperating with other nation states going after, say, members of a mafia or other criminal organization for tax evasion? And is this good enough? Rather than answer that directly, what I'll say is it's a start. Nation states working together, even despite the political climate or the socioeconomic climate that we're all facing, is a step in the right direction. Sharing intelligence, a great thing. Arrests being made, criminals being brought to justice. It shows that these crimes don't go unpunished. So is it good enough? Not sure, but it's definitely a start. Another question that came in, recent tensions with Russia around Ukraine and other happenings in Eastern Europe will lead to more state-sponsored malware. Well, there's no connection that we have to say that the Revil Group is a state-sponsored threat actor. In fact, the arrest made by the FSB would actually make a statement in the other regard. But I think what you're going to see in my prediction is that if there is another kinetic warfare or any type of invasion that happens, that cyber will be a part of it, and we will start to see cyber attacks being a part of what would traditionally be, kinetic warfare, where nation states drop bombs and send in troops.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like a lot of the opportunity for disruption is in the cyberspace these days, especially with our dependence on data. We got another one, Matt. Let's see. Talk a little bit about the Office files. Let's see. Given today's hybrid workforce, use of video conference and other enterprise cloud apps are frequently used to share files. What option exists for securing those viewing, right, or downloads? Want to talk a little bit about how we think about files and protecting those and different controls around them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should look at this in two ways. One is from the inside out, your data, the files that you want to protect, and the other is from the outside in, the files that are going to get sent and shared with your employees. But let's start with the inside out approach. So you're going to have it's probably millions, tens of millions, 100 millions of files inside of Office 365. Not all files are created equal, though. You will have some that contain your most sensitive and important information on your clients, financial records, information about the fact that your filings, if your company is publicly traded, or even potentially your intellectual property. If you were going to do everything that you could to protect those files, you first would figure out where they all are. You would make sure that only the right people or the people with valid business needs have access to those files, and you would watch how people interact with them and look for signs of misuse or abuse of that data. Now, putting that outside in perspective on, how can you help and educate your end users on how to deal with the threats that are incoming through those files? The first step is obviously security awareness. Much like we talked about that Zoom vulnerability, not accepting contact requests, not opening files from untrusted sources, and making sure that you're using defense in depth is always going to be a great approach. Something that can spot the known attacks, things like signature-based detections that you can get on your endpoints, and things that can spot the unknown, like behavior analytics, potentially from Varonis. I don't see any other questions that have come in so far. The only other one, and this was more of a prediction, David, if maybe you want to take this one, is there any type of sleeper cyber threat that might be waiting to be triggered, potentially with physical consequences? Do you have any predictions?
It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Wise men once said. Logically speaking, with all the research going on, I think it would be naive to think that there aren't vulnerabilities out there that people have discovered that could be exploited at some time. Who has discovered them and what they would do with them. Obviously, I wouldn't want to speculate on, but I think that what we're seeing is, there's so many vectors to get to data that the naive thing is to really kind of not have layers of defense, right? You want to, with the whole zero trust mindset, not counting on any one particular layer, not counting on any one particular line of fence to be the be all and end all. Seems like a pretty solid strategy. What do you think?
Yeah, and one thing that I would add to that, a very brilliant and talented security researcher named Yossi Sassi, he instilled in me this concept that for attackers, the only thing that it takes is time and motivation in order to achieve an objective. So all these things that we can think of are better answered by, is the thing that attacker is trying to do worth their time and motivation in order to make it happen? Because if so, there is probably an attacker out there that's going to make it happen. Another really wise piece of advice that I got from a former FBI director was that it's not a matter of if, but when you're going to experience a cyber incident or a cyber breach. And that, feeling like you're not a target or it can never happen to you, it's not a defensive strategy. So make sure you're doing things like simulating what would happen if an attack, whether tabletop or real, in order to be able to be prepared for what's going to happen if maybe you missed a host that's running Log4Shell and an advanced attacker gets inside of your environment, or you haven't patched Zoom yet and someone's able to get inside and execute arbitrary code. These are just a couple of the vectors that attackers use to get to data. And I think that's just about everything, David. So we'll keep it open for just another minute or two to see if we've got any other great questions. Otherwise, as always, our viewers, we appreciate you. Thanks for being here. We hope that you enjoyed it today. We always appreciate your feedback. If you've got any, things you want to make sure we include in another episode of the State of Cybercrime in 30 minutes, feel free to let us know.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Matt. Great to see you. Thanks, everybody, for joining.